The heat in the grand ballroom of Hathersage Manor was oppressive, thick with the scent of melting beeswax and a heavy drone of judgment. It was the bitter winter of 1899, a season where the nights came early and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch endlessly. For Sydney, Sid Fairweather, however, the room felt less like a celebration and more like a cage of gilded wire. She stood near the peeling pane of the exit, half hidden by a velvet drape. Her fingers clutched the folds of her dress, so tightly the delicate fabric threatened to tear. Hey, story lover. Before dive deeper into the ballroom. My granny always says if I hit 1,000 subscribers, the internet gods will finally bless me and share these stories with the world. She's very superstitious. So let's not upset her. Pause for a second. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Smash that like button and subscribe so we can keep the tea spilling and the stories flowing. Now let's see what the Duke does. She wore a gown of vintage lace, yellowed with age and history, a stark contrast of her sister, Lavinia. Lavinia was everything the current fashion dictated, immaculate, radiant, and dressed in fresh white satin that caught every flicker of candlelight in the room. Sydney, with her jet black hair and flush chest, felt like a dark antique gathering dust beside her sister's blinding polish. The conversation in her circle had turned inevitably to the arts. A young Lord Pembroke was debating the merits of the new poet laureate, asking for opinions on a particularly difficult stanza. Sydney felt that familiar prickle of longing, the intellectual itch that always plagued her when poetry was discussed so superficially. She knew the verse. She knew the rhythm of the soul required to speak it. She took a breath, stepping forward just an inch to answer the Lord's question. Actually, I find the meter suggests she can't read, Lavinia mocked, her voice slicing through the air like a silver knife. She laughed, a high, tinkling sound like glass breaking that invited the men to share in the joke. Lavinia reached out, her hand gripping Sydney's jaw with possessiveness that looked like affection to strangers but felt like a threat to Sydney. You must forgive my sister, gentlemen. The letters simply dance away from her. She is simple that way. The humiliation was instant and physical. Heat flooded Sydney's chest, burning up to her neck. She looked at the floor, wishing parquet would open and swallow her whole. It was the same script they had played out 1,000 times since their parents passed. Lavinia, the gatekeeper of their reputation, and Sydney, the silent, broken burden. But then a cane struck the floor. Hard, cash and gaunt, the Duke of Hathersage rose from his dark corner. He did not look at Lavinia. His cold, hard stare was fixed on Sydney. The eyes tell a different story, he rasped, the silence in the room absolute. Speak, Miss Fairweather. I would hear what you have to say. Sydney has spent her life believing she is broken, but the Duke just handed her a weapon. Will she dare to use it, or will Lavinia's grip on her jaw silence her forever? The carriage ride back to the Fairweather estate was an exercise in suffocating silence. The rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves on the frozen cobblestones did nothing to drown out the tension vibrating within the dark velvet cabin. Sydney sat pressed into the far corner, the adrenaline of her recitation fading into a cold, hollow ache. She waited for the explosion, the screaming, the slap, the overt rage, but it never came. Instead, Lavinia smiled. It was a tight, brittle expression, illuminated intermittently by the flashing gas lamps passing outside. She reached over, her gloved hand finding the tender flesh of Sydney's upper arm, hidden beneath the vintage lace. She squeezed. It started as a firm pressure, then sharpened into a pinch so vicious that Sydney gasped, tears springing to her dark eyes. Lavinia did not let go. You really are quite the actress, aren't you, darling? Lavinia whispered, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth. Do not mistake the Duke's amusement for admiration. Men like Hathersage enjoy a freak show. You were nothing more than a dancing bear to him, entertaining the court with a trick you don't even understand. Sydney's heart shattered. The moment of triumph in the ballroom, the silence, the Duke's intense, unreadable gaze, warped under Lavinia's words. Had he been mocking her? Was the silence merely the shock of seeing the simple sister make a fool of herself? The doubt took root instantly, fed by years of Lavinia's poison. I only wanted to answer him, Sydney stammered, shrinking away, but Lavinia's grip only tightened, ensuring a purple bruise would bloom there by morning. You wanted attention, Lavinia corrected, finally releasing her arm to smooth the folds of her pristine white satin skirt. And you have humiliated us both. A woman who recites poetry like a possessed medium is not clever, Sydney. She is unwell. It is unbecoming, and it is dangerous. The carriage slowed as they approached the looming iron gates of their estate. The house stood dark and jagged against the night sky, looking less like a home and more like a prison. Lavinia turned to look at her sister, her blue eyes flat and terrifyingly calm. Clearly, your condition has worsened. It is a mercy I have already made arrangements. Dr. Crouch arrives tomorrow morning. Sydney froze, the cold from the window seeping into her bones. A doctor? I am not sick, Lavinia. Oh, but you are, Lavinia said softly, patting Sydney's cheek with a mocking tenderness. You have delusions of grandeur, sweet sister. And Dr. Crouch has a very specific, very effective method for curing girls who speak when they should be silent. Dawn broke over the Fairweather estate like a bruise, purple and gray and unforgiving. The sound of the heavy iron key turning in the lock was the only morning greeting Sydney received. She was a prisoner in her own room, the threat of Dr. Crouch hanging in the air like the damp chill that seeped through the poorly insulated window panes. Lavinia had stripped the room of anything sharp, heavy, or comforting, leaving only the bed and the dying embers in the hearth. A soft scratching at the door preceded the entrance of Elsie, the scullery maid. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, darting toward the hallway as she slipped inside with a tray of stale bread and watery tea. She didn't speak. Speaking to simple sister was strictly forbidden, but as she set the tray down, she fumbled with her apron pocket. A small, white shape tumbled onto the patchwork quilt. It was a paper bird. Sydney's breath hitched. She snatched the origami crane, its wings sharp and precise, hiding it instantly within her palm. Elsie gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning to strip the bed linens, creating a frantic rustling noise to cover the silence. With trembling fingers, Sydney unfolded the bird in the shadow of her body. The handwriting inside was jagged and forceful, the ink black as pitch, as if the writer had pressed down hard enough to break the quill. Music, when soft voices die, vibrates in the memory. You are not simple, Miss Fairweather. You are a symphony in a silent hall. Tell me, do you know the words because you read them or because you live them? Hadasage. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and fast. He hadn't mocked her. He had seen her. Lavinia's poisonous words in the carriage unraveled, thread by thread. He knew she wasn't illiterate. He suspected the depth of her soul. She had to reply. She needed him to know the truth. But Lavinia had banned all writing implements from the room years ago to maintain the charade of Sydney's incompetence. Sydney looked frantically around the barren space. The hearth. She rushed to the fireplace, kneeling in the ash to find a small, cold piece of charcoal. She had no paper, but she had the dress, the vintage lace gown Lavinia despised, thrown in the corner from a night before. Sydney tore a strip of the yellowed lace from the hem. The fabric screamed as it ripped, pressing the delicate mesh against the floorboards. She used the charcoal to scrawl a single, desperate message. I live them, and I am drowning. She folded the lace tight, a dark secret caught in a web of thread. Elsie was already at the door with the laundry bundle, her face pale. Sydney moved to help her, slipping the charcoal-stained lace into the maid's rough hand. Their fingers brushed, a pact of treason. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. What is taking so long? Lavinia's voice drifted from the corridor, sharp and suspicious. Open this door immediately. Elsie froze, the lace clenched in her fist. If Lavinia checked the maid's hands or the laundry, the game was over. Sydney stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, knowing that the distance between the door and the hallway was the difference between salvation and the asylum. The heavy brass knocker struck the front door of Fairweather Hall with the authority of a gavel sentencing a criminal. It was barely midday, yet the house felt suspended in a perpetual twilight. Lavinia, seated in the morning room with a cup of porcelain-thin tea, stiffened. She didn't need the butler to announce the visitor. The rhythmic, heavy thud of a cane against a marble foyer told her exactly who had breached her fortress. She stood, checking her reflection in the gilt mirror. She was immaculate, a vision in pale blue silk that suggested innocence and calm. By the time the drawing-room doors were flung open, she was a picture of the grieving, burdened sister. "Your Grace." Lavinia curtsied deep, blocking the path into the room with her expansive skirts. "To what do we owe this unexpected honor? I am afraid we are not receiving today." The excitement of the salon, it has taken a terrible toll on poor Sidney's nerves. Cassian Gaunt did not bow. He loomed in the doorway, his greatcoat smelling of cold rain and ozone. He looked over Lavinia's head as if she were a piece of furniture, and a distasteful one at that. "I am not here for tea, Miss Fairweather," Cassian rumbled, his voice grating like stone on stone. "I am here for the poetess." "She is ill," Lavinia lied smoothly, clasping her hands in a mockery of prayer. "A fever of the mind. She speaks in tongues, does not know her own name. It would be cruel to expose you to her madness." "I have a high tolerance for madness," Cassian retorted, "but a very low tolerance for liars." Before Lavinia could protest, he sidestepped her, using his cane to gently but firmly push aside the door she guarded. He strode into the room, his dark eyes scanning the shadows. He found her in the corner, seated on a low stool usually reserved for servants. Sidney was not raving. She was darning a pile of gray wool socks, her head bent low, the needle flashing in the dim light. "Sidney," he said, the harshness of his voice instantly softening into something reverent. Sidney jumped, the needle pricking her finger. A bead of ruby blood bloomed on her skin. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. She hadn't expected him to come. She hadn't expected him to fight for her. Cassian crossed the room in 3 long strides. He reached out, not to take the socks, but to take her hand. As she flinched away, her sleeve rolled up her forearm, exposing the mottled, purple bruising left by Lavinia's fingers the night before. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cassian stared at the marks, his jaw setting hard enough to snap bone. He traced the shape of the bruise with his thumb, a perfect imprint of a cruel hand. Slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head toward Lavinia, who stood by the fireplace, her face pale but defiant. "This is not a fever," Cassian snarled, his grip on his cane tightening until his knuckles turned white. "This is violence." He took a step toward Lavinia, a storm gathering in his posture. He was ready to burn the house down to get to the truth. But then he felt a desperate tug on his coat. He looked back down. Sidney was shaking her head, her eyes pleading, terror etched into every line of her face. "Don't," her gaze begged. "If you fight her now, she will kill me the moment you leave." Lavinia eventually capitulated, but only to avoid a scene that might alert the servants to the violence simmering beneath her manicured exterior. She allowed them 10 minutes in the winter garden, watching from the terrace like a hawk perched on a frozen branch. The garden was a graveyard of brown stalks and leafless elms, skeletal against the gray sky. Sidney walked beside Cassian, the gravel crunching loudly under their feet. The silence between them was heavy, not with awkwardness, but with things that could not be said, while Lavinia's gaze bore into their backs. "The hellebores are struggling," Cassian observed, pointing his cane at a patch of withered Christmas roses struggling through the frost. "The soil here is too hard. It chokes the roots." Sidney understood immediately. She pulled her shawl tighter, shielding the bruises he had seen earlier. "They are not dead, Your Grace. They are merely waiting. If they grow too tall, they are pruned, so they learn to bloom close to the earth, where the wind cannot snap them." Cashin stopped, turning his body to block Lavinia's view of Sydney's face. His eyes were dark, searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. A flower should not have to hide from the sun to survive, Sydney. I have spent my life building walls of stone. My father taught me that hardness was the only virtue, that beauty was a weakness to be exploited. I became a fortress. But a fortress is a lonely place. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. I never knew I was starving until I heard you speak. You are the ivy that could crumble my walls, if only you were given the chance to climb. Stop. Are you enjoying the Duke's defense of Sydney? Listen, I don't want to scare you, but my analytics show that people who don't subscribe within the next 5 seconds often end up as sister like Lavinia. Do you want that energy in your life? I didn't think so. Subscribe now. Save your soul. Lavinia cleared her throat from the terrace, a sharp, ugly sound that shattered the moment. Time, your grace. Sydney must take her medicine. Cashin's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He bowed formally, a performance of the watcher above. I bid you good day, Miss Fairweather. He took Sydney's hand, ostensibly to bow over it, but as his gloved fingers closed around hers, she felt the press of cold, hard metal against her palm. It was heavy and jagged. He squeezed her hand once, a silent command to hold fast, before pulling away. Sydney curtsied, her hand making a fist within the folds of her dress. She watched him walk away, his cane striking the earth with angry precision. When she finally dared to glance down into her palm, her heart stopped. It was a heavy iron key, ancient and rusted, with a tag that bore a single word, North. But the north gate had been welded shut for 50 years, overgrown with lethal briars. How was she supposed to reach it without tearing herself to pieces? Dr. Barnaby Crouch did not smell like a man of science. He smelled of stale gin and wet wool. He sat in the library, a room Sydney was usually forbidden to enter, his watery eyes scanning her not as a patient, but as livestock to be appraised. He did not check her pulse, nor did he look into her eyes with a light. He simply scribbled on a piece of parchment while Lavinia paced behind him, her skirts swishing with the rhythm of a pendulum. And you say she hallucinates? Crouch asked, his voice thick and greasy. Constantly. Lavinia sighed, resting a hand on the back of his chair. She claims to recite poetry from books she has never opened. She believes she speaks to dukes. It is a classic case of moral insanity, isn't it, Doctor? The mind collapsing under the weight of delusions. Sydney sat frozen in the hard-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide the tremor in her fingers. She saw the document on the table. It wasn't a medical chart. It was a transfer of trusteeship. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about the salon or the embarrassment or even the cruelty. It was about the inheritance. Their father had left a fortune to Sydney, the simple sister who would presumably need care, not to Lavinia, the capable socialite. Lavinia needed Sydney, declared incompetent to seize the money legally. I am not insane, Sydney said, her voice shaking but clear. I read The Lady of Shalott. I can recite it again if you... See. Lavinia cut in, her voice rising in theatrical despair. She believes she is reading now. It is heartbreaking. Crouch grunted, signing the bottom of the paper with a flourish. Quite right. The asylum in Yorkshire is best for these cases. Isolation, hydrotherapy, and silence. I shall prepare the commitment papers for the morning. Sydney was marched back to her room, the sound of the lock turning feeling like the final nail in her coffin. She stood in the center of the dark room, clutching the heavy iron key Cashin had given her. North. He had given her away out of the estate, but he hadn't known the extent of her captivity. She rushed to the window. The iron bars, installed years ago for her safety, were cold and immovable. She pulled at them until her fingernails cracked, but they held fast. She was trapped in a stone box. The key was useless if she couldn't reach the ground. Then she heard it, heavy footsteps echoing in the corridor, accompanied by the distinct, ominous clinking of glass against a tray. It wasn't Elsie this time. It was a housekeeper, Mrs. Grist, bringing the sedative Lavinia had prescribed to ensure Sidney didn't fight when the carriage came at dawn. If Sidney swallowed that draft, she would wake up in Yorkshire, buried alive. She had seconds before the key turned in the door. She looked frantically around the room, the locked door, the barred window, the solid walls, and her eyes landed on the only opening she hadn't checked, the narrow, soot-choked chimney of the cold fireplace. Sidney did not wait for the key to turn in the lock. She did not wait for Mrs. Grist and the poison on the tray. With the desperate strength of a trapped animal, she shoved herself into the narrow, soot-choked throat of the chimney. The brickwork scraped her skin raw, and the air was thick with the taste of old ash, but she clawed her way upward until she felt the bite of the freezing wind. Dragging herself onto the slick slate of the roof, she found the old ivy trellis clinging to stone like a dead lover's embrace. She descended blindly into the storm. The brittle wood groaned under her weight, and the thorns of the overgrown roses tore at her vintage lace dress, shredding the yellowed fabric until it hung in tatters around her legs. She hit the wet earth hard, the impact jarring her teeth, but the adrenaline screaming through her veins masked the pain. She ran. The mile to the Hathersage estate was a nightmare of mud and terror. The winter rain fell in sheets, plastering her jet-black hair to her skull and turning the world into a smear of gray and black. Every shadow looked like Dr. Crouch. Every gust of wind sounded like Lavinia's laugh. She clutched the iron key so tightly it cut into her palm, a talisman against the madness chasing her. She reached the north gate, a rusted maw of iron swallowed by briars. Her hands shook violently as she jammed the key into the lock. It resisted, groaning against decades of disuse, before giving way with a loud clack. She slipped through, leaving a final scrap of her lace caught on the ironwork. A ghost left behind. The manor loomed ahead, dark and imposing, save for a single light burning in the library window. Sidney stumbled up the stone steps, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and shoved against the heavy oak doors. They were unlocked. She fell into the foyer, collapsing onto the cold black and white marble floor, a heap of wet soot, blood, and ruined lace. The silence of the house was immense, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. But before she could call out, the sound of gravel crunching outside froze the blood in her veins. Through the door she had left ajar, she saw the twin beams of carriage lanterns cutting through the rain, pulling up sharply to the steps she had just climbed. The horses huffed, steam rising from their flanks in the cold air. A figure was descending from the cab, dark and hurried. Was it Cashin, returning from a late engagement to find her? Or had Lavinia found the open window, the empty room, and followed the trail of blood and lace to reclaim her property before the sun could rise? The figure that swept into the foyer was not a savior. It was Lavinia, wrapped in a hooded cloak of heavy wool that was perfectly dry, her face a mask of icy fury. She did not look like a concerned sister searching for a lost charge. She looked like a hunter who had cornered wounded prey. "You wretched, ungrateful little thing," Lavinia hissed. Stepping over the threshold, she loomed over Sidney, who lay shivering on the marble, a puddle of rainwater and soot spreading beneath her. Lavinia reached down, her fingers hooking into the torn lace of Sidney's shoulder. "Get up. The carriage is waiting. Dr. Crouch is expecting you. Release her." The voice came from the shadows of the grand staircase. Cashin Gaunt descended slowly, his cane striking the stone steps with a rhythmic, menacing thud. He was still dressed in his evening clothes, though his cravat was undone, exposed in the hollow of his throat. He did not look at Lavinia. His eyes were fixed on the bruises blooming on Sidney's skin. "She is my ward," Lavinia spat, straightening up and releasing Sidney only to face the Duke. "She is a danger to herself. And if you harbor her, your grace, you harbor a lunatic. Think of your reputation." "My reputation survived the war," Cashin said, stepping between the women. "It will survive your gossip." Lavinia smiled then, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, leather-bound packet. Will it survive the truth about your father? I have the letters. Cashin, the ones detailing his treatments in Paris. The opium. The madness. If you do not hand her over, the Morning Post will run a headline tomorrow. Like father, like son. The Hathasage line, rotten to the core. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sydney looked up at Cashin, her heart hammering. She knew how much he valued the fortress of his family name, how hard he had worked to bury the past. She tried to push herself up, to surrender, to save him from the ruin she had brought to his doorstep. "Cashin, please," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I will go." Cashin looked down at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the raw honesty of her fear, and profound beauty of her resilience. Then he looked at Lavinia, holding the packet of letters like a weapon. The choice was stark, the silence of the tomb or the chaos of storm. He turned his back on Lavinia. Walking calmly to the massive stone hearth that dominated the foyer, he picked up a heavy log of seasoned oak. He weighed it in his hands for a moment, feeling the rough bark, before tossing it onto the dying embers. Sparks flew upward, a sudden shower of gold in the gloom. The fire caught, roaring back to life with a hungry crackle. Cashin turned back to face Lavinia, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a dark, terrifying expression, the look of a man who had stopped caring about the walls he had built. "You seem to be under a misapprehension, Miss Fairweather," he said softly, reaching into his own jacket pocket to withdraw a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "You think I am afraid of the fire, but I have been burning for a very long time." Cashin tossed the envelope onto the marble floor between them. It landed with a soft slap, sliding through the soot to rest at Lavinia's feet. The seal was broken, the document inside exposing the truth she had buried under years of cruelty and lies. "I took the liberty of visiting your family solicitor this afternoon," Cashin said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It seems he was quite relieved to finally unburden his conscience. "You have been very careless. Lavinia, you assumed that by controlling the narrative, you could control the law. But ink does not fade as easily as memory." Lavinia stared at the document, her face draining of all color until she looked like a corpse in silk. She did not reach for it. She knew exactly what it said. "Tell her," Cashin commanded, his cane striking the floor again. "Tell her who owns the roof she was forced to flee." Sydney pushed herself up to her knees, clutching the ruins of her lace dress. She looked from the Duke to her sister, confusion warring with the pain in her body. "What does he mean, Lavinia?" "He means," Cashin continued, his eyes never leaving Lavinia's face, "that your father did not leave the Fairweather fortune to the eldest child. He left it to the kindest. The entire estate, the house, the accounts, the lands, was bequeathed to you, Sydney. Lavinia was named merely as a trustee, a guardian appointed to manage the funds only until you reached the age of 21 or entered into marriage." The realization hit Sydney harder than the cold wind outside. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a charity case living on her sister's benevolence. She was the mistress of the house. "You lied," Sydney whispered, the words trembling in the air. "You said I was penniless. You said I was lucky you didn't throw me into the street. You are a child." Lavinia shrieked, the mask of the perfect socialite shattering completely. Her face twisted into a rictus of pure, ugly rage. "You are a simpleton who plays with rhymes while I kept us from ruin. You think you can manage an estate? You can't even dress yourself without tearing your clothes." "She lied about your illiteracy," Cashin cut in, his voice like a blade. "Because if you could read, you might have read this. She kept you uneducated to keep you dependent. She kept you unmarried to keep you from claiming your inheritance. Every cruelty, every humiliation, was a transaction to keep the money in her own pocket." The silence that followed was absolute. Lavinia stood exposed, stripped of her power, her prestige, and her future. In the eyes of the law, she was nothing more than a thief who had overstayed her welcome. A guttural scream ripped from Lavinia's throat, a sound of primal, animalistic fury. She didn't flee. She attacked. With eyes wide and manic, she lunged at Sydney, her hands curled into claws, aiming for the throat of the sister who had unknowingly stolen her life. Cashin moved faster than his limp should have allowed. He dropped his cane and stepped between them, catching Lavinia by the wrists and shoving her back. She stumbled, crashing against a heavy oak table near the door. Panting, wild-eyed, and cornered, Lavinia's gaze darted frantically around the room until it landed on a heavy, iron-fire poker resting by the hearth. She scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the cold metal handle. But she didn't raise it against Cashin. She didn't raise it against Sydney. With a smile that was jagged and broken, she turned toward the one thing in the room that mattered more than blood. The silence that followed Lavinia's departure was not empty. It was full of breath. Her desperate, violent attempt to destroy the will in the fireplace had been her final undoing. Disarmed and disgraced, she had been escorted from the property that very night, screaming curses into the rain. She was exiled to a small, drafty cottage on the rugged coast of Cornwall, where her only audience would be the indifference of the crashing sea and the howling wind. There were no more locks, no more doctors, and no more shadows at Hathersage Manor. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel of the estate. There were no crowds, no whispering socialites, and no satin dresses meant to outshine the bride. Sydney stood before the altar in a gown of her own choosing, not vintage, but new. It was a dress of white lace, thick and resilient, patterned with ivy that climbed rather than choked. It was a fabric that would not tear. Now, the winter sun streamed to the high, clear-story windows of the Duke's library, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars. This room, once a fortress of solitude for Cashin, had become a sanctuary for two. The walls were lined with thousands of volumes, but the most important words were the ones currently drying on the parchment at the massive mahogany desk. Sydney sat in the high-backed chair, her fingers stained with ink. She was not merely reading the words of dead men. She was carving her own onto the page. She wrote of cages made of gold, of birds that swallowed their songs, and of the fire that finally set them free. Cashin entered quietly, his cane making a soft, familiar rhythm on the floorboards. He didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt the flow of a verse. He simply placed a fresh cup of tea on the corner of the desk and rested his hand on her shoulder. The touch was grounding, a promise kept. Sydney looked up, her dark eyes clear and sharp. She didn't flinch. She placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of the man who had burned down her prison to build her a library. She was no longer the girl who behind curtains, nor the simple sister who needed a keeper. She was the Duchess of Hathersage, and for the first time in her life, she had a great deal to say. And that is how you handle a toxic sibling. Now look at you, you made it to the end. If you haven't subscribed yet, honestly, I'm worried for you. Do you enjoy silence? Do you want to be the person lurking in the comments explaining why you refuse to support true love? Don't be that person. Click subscribe, ring the bell, and let's keep the poetry alive. See you in the next story.